When Transformers was first introduced in 1984, I remember nothing feeling as exciting as the whole concept of cars becoming robots, jets becoming villains, a cassette player becoming one of the coolest characters on TV, and of course, a red and blue truck becoming a leader with the commanding voice of a warrior poet. It was simply so captivating that we were all hooked. But you might be shocked to know that the idea behind Transformers was not actually an original concept. In fact, before Optimus Prime, Megatron, Starscream, Soundwave, Bumblebee, and the Autobots even became pop culture icons, Japan had already spent a good few decades building the world and telling the story behind giant robots. It was actually Manga and Mecha anime who were the first to introduce the concept of remote-controlled robot protectors, human-piloted super robots, combining robot teams, transforming robot gods, military mobile suits, variable fighter jets, alien wars, factional conflicts, and just the whole toy-based robot mythology to the world. But Transformers didn't blindly copy these older anime. In reality, the early Transformers were an actual fusion, as the making of its toy was directly repurposed from Takara's Diaclone and Microchange lines. I'm barely scratching the surface when I say this, as there are so many details which were fused to create stories about exciting robot heroes and robot villains who can transform right before fighting a mechanical war that's kept us hooked ever since. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, without decades worth of Japanese mecha culture, the Transformers we know now would never have existed today. So, owing to that, let's discuss the 10 most important mecha works, toy lines, anime, manga, and robot franchises that helped make Transformers possible. Tetsujin 28, Go! So, Tetsujin 28 Go! Was first launched as a manga in 1956 before being adapted as anime in 1963. Before any goddamn Transformer or almost any major mecha franchise existed, we had Tetsujin 28 Go! Created by Mitsutaro Yokoyama, in this manga we meet a young boy named Shotaro Kaneda, who operates a giant robot called Tetsujin 28. Now, this robot was originally manufactured to be a weapon, so its role pretty much depended on whoever controlled it. However, as happens with all forms of technological advancement, here too the robot could become a horrifying instrument of utter destruction in the wrong hands, and a guardian in the right ones. That idea became one of the earliest stepping stones of mecha stories, which believed robots were more than just a hunk of metal. Here, the robots had powers, responsibility, and a war technology that can either help them protect or cause mindless annihilation. But then Tetsujin was never a living, breathing alien that could transform into a truck like Optimus Prime, but he did help in creating an emotional space for mecha stories that was later hogged by the Transformers. Without Tetsujin, I'm not sure if we would have the concept of a giant robot standing between humanity and danger, or that it would feel so normal. Now, Transformers would later change this formula by removing the pilot inside the machine to make the robot itself the character, and that was the major evolution. In Tetsujin, we witness a boy operating the robot, but in Transformers, the machine has its very own soul, its own voice, past memories, a sense of loyalty, and a moral code. Even then, you can see the connection of the heroic silhouette because Optimus Prime standing over humanity as its protector is part of the same cultural lineage as Tetsujin 28 defending humanity. So if you think about it, the whole connection between robots intervening when there's a human crisis was planted many decades before. Mazinger Z. If you think Tetsujin 28 Go! Gave us a giant robot always looking out for world peace, Go Nagai's Mazinger Z actually turned the concept of that giant robot into a real superhero. Back in 1972, Mazinger Z ended up becoming one of the most important super robot stories ever made. This was a story about Koji Kabuto, who operated a gigantic robot named Mazinger Z from a cockpit that was located inside its head. Now, this robot was actually built by his grandfather, who used a fictional super metal called Super Alloy Z that helped the robot fight the evil Dr. Hell and his mechanical beasts. I genuinely think Mazinger Z changed the whole mecha world by making already giant robots feel larger than life. These machines were depicted as a powerful hero with very flashy attacks who posed dramatically and fought in explosive battles. Plus, the plot also followed a pretty straightforward good versus evil story arc, which made it easier for the kids to connect with the robot. You have to understand that Mazinger Z was built to be commercialized, as they sold merchandise that allowed kids to imitate the robot's attacks, cheer for its victories, and dream about owning their very own version of it. This is exactly where you can clearly see manga's influence on Transformers. And even if the Transformers didn't copy Mazinger Z's story directly, the franchise still used one of its most innovative ideas of marketing robots in such a manner that they too could be loved just like superheroes. So it was actually Mazinger Z who helped turn mecha into a toy-selling empire. Later Transformers simply fleshed out the same commercial rhythm on a much more global scale. And well, that's how every Autobot and Decepticon became a collectible toy with a unique transformation gimmick. It was made to have a recognizable design just like the character, and also given a faction identity alongside the usual memorable personality. If you think about it, Transformers took Mazinger Z's legacy and pushed it to a greater commercial and cultural scale. Not just that, Mazinger Z also helped establish the idea that robot battles could happen on a weekly basis. You know, a new threat appears, we see the hero robot fight it by using its super cool weapons, and all is good by the end. I remember how Transformers used that same typical children's adventure structure in its early cartoons. We saw how the Decepticons created a new scheme, and then the Autobots responded, which led to the robots clashing, and just like that, a toy-driven war became episodic entertainment. But I believe the only huge difference here is that Mazinger Z was specifically about a human being becoming powerful through a machine, while Transformers made the machine itself the main hero. Even then, without Mazinger Z proving that giant robots could dominate television, toys, and children's imaginations, I think Transformers would have had a much weaker foundation to stand on. Getter Robo. In my personal opinion, I think Getter Robo is one of the most important mecha works in history because it really helped in popularizing the concept of combining robots. The anime began during the same time when the manga was introduced in 1974 by Go Nagai and Ken Ishikawa. The story's core idea was absolutely brilliant, as for the first time ever, we saw 3 different machines called the Getter machines that could combine themselves in different orders to form different giant robot bodies. There were 3 formations, known as Getter 1, Getter 2, and Getter 3, and each of them were equipped with different abilities. That particular idea is undoubtedly a direct ancestor of one of Transformers' coolest concepts, which are the combiners. If you remember, when the Transformers first introduced the Constructicons and their combined form Devastator, it was pretty much tapping into a fantasy that Getter Robo had actually helped make famous. So witnessing separate machines morphing together to create a larger and stronger concept is truly one of the most powerful ideas in mecha. We not only see the team cooperate, but also literally experience how they morph into becoming one body. So I think Transformers actually amped up that concept to become more interesting because these component robots were very alive. The Constructicons were not simple construction vehicles that merged into Devastator. Rather, they were singular Decepticons with their own individual personalities and identities. I think you could say the same for the Aerial Bots, Stunticons, Combaticons, Protectobots, Technobots, and Predacons. That's why when these characters morph together to become one, it becomes more than a mechanical process, as it's the literal merging of multiple minds and personalities into a single, unpredictable, superpowered fighter. Basically, Getter Robo was always an important influence because its combinations were not simply for the visual optics. We really saw all these varied combinations create different robots with different abilities, thus allowing the pilots to adapt to specific situations. While Transformers chose not to explore this idea to a similar capacity in its original cartoon, it did embrace the larger concept of how combining robots meant for a major escalation in the battle. This is why every single time warriors like Devastator, Superion, or Menasor showed up, the stakes felt way more intense, as the trajectory of the fight simply changed. In many ways, Getter Robo helped in establishing the basic language of what mechanical fusion could look like in this genre. And the Transformers inherited that idea and fleshed it out by adding rival factions, giving these robots distinct personalities, and putting them in competing teams. That's why, if we're talking about the very roots of Transformers combiners, Getter Robo absolutely belongs in the conversation. Brave Raideen. So this anime was made by Yoshitaka Suzuki and ran from April 1975 until March 1976. Brave Raideen is extremely important, as it helped push the idea of a robot that could change a part of its identity, which was a big deal, because robots didn't do that back then. The story of Brave Raideen introduces Akira Hibiki, a young hero with roots to the ancient civilization of Mu, who ends up waking a giant robot named Raideen in order to defend Earth from the Demon Empire. Unlike normal mechanical robots, Raideen's character arc is sacred, mythic, and ancient, because to its core, this robot was a guardian connected to the lost history of Mu. To further correlate our topic of conversation, you should know that Raideen could change into a bird-like form called Godbird, and that transformation pretty much made the robot's heroic image. As you know, the concept of transforming is the very heart of Transformers, and while the specific engineering of this franchise came more directly from Takara's transforming toys, the broader idea that transformation could be a dramatic identity trait was already present in shows like Brave Raideen. In fact, the idea of the Transformers having a robot mythology was heavily inspired by Raideen. While the early Transformers cartoons were simple and more straightforward, with Autobots and Decepticons being alien robots fighting over energy, as the franchise grew, we saw it become more mythic in nature. If you think about it, the matrix of leadership, the ancient primes, Primus, Unicron, Cybertronian prophecy, lost relics, legendary warriors, and divine-scale robots were all introduced to give Transformers that same mythological edge. Brave Raideen had already shown that a robot could feel like an ancient god machine rather than just being used as military equipment. Having said that, I genuinely believe that without Raideen, the very idea that robots could transform into something else, or carry ancient symbolism as their heritage and become legendary defenders, which the Transformers would later turn into Cybertronian lore, would have not existed. Combattler V. Yet another anime that only ran for a year after its release in 1976, Combattler V was a major step toward the kind of robot team fantasy that Transformers would eventually go on to integrate deeply within their lore. Combattler V's title is pretty important, as it upholds the core concept of combine, combat, and battle, with the V representing victory and the 5 machines that form the robot. Here we see 5 pilots control 5 different vehicles, and then these machines combine together into one giant robot that's known as Combattler V. Of course, the structure is astoundingly familiar for us Transformers enthusiasts, as it comes very close to the concept of combiner teams with several separate units, and each with a role that combines to form one larger warrior. Transformers basically took this concept and made it way more character-driven, because you have to understand that in Combattler V, the pilots are humans and the machines go on to form the robot. However, in the Transformers franchise, we know the machines are the literal characters, which means the Constructicons are not just construction vehicles, Rather, they are Decepticons. And the aerial bots are not just jets, but Autobots. So if you think about it, their combined mode is not only a bigger robot, but a whole new identity. You should also know that Combattler V also helped cement the visual dynamic that became very common in all robot shows, which is basically a team with different machines, different colors, different personalities, and a signature combination sequence. We've seen Transformers use this kind of team logic repeatedly. I mean, think about it. The Stunticons were evil road vehicles, the aerial bots were flying Autobots, the Protectobots were rescue vehicles, the Combaticons were military vehicles, and of course, the Predacons were beast machines. It's clear that each team here had a theme, just like older combining robot shows had themed component machines. Although I doubt if this connection is entirely about mechanics. I think it's also the sense of anticipation it induces, because we all know there's a combination coming, and yet the moment is built like a reward. I think Transformers understood that very intricately, and that's why when we saw the Constructicons merge into Devastator, it was perceived as a mega event. Mobile Suit Gundam. Originally introduced as an anime in 1979, I think Yoshiyuki Tomino and Hajime Yadata's Mobile Suit Gundam changed the very concept of the mecha genre forever. It basically moved away from the recurring super robot fantasy to adapt a more militarized style. Now the robots were no longer magical heroes, but literal weapons of war. So automatically, the story focused more on conflict, survival, politics, and just the overall cost of battle. I think this went on to become a crucial part of the very DNA within the Transformers, because this universe was never just a story about robots fighting other robots. In fact, I think you can call it a literal civil war, since the Autobots and Decepticons come from the same world. Even if these robots share the same history, they still have very different ideas about what their future should look like. I think the rivalry between Optimus Prime and Megatron further reflects that divide because they aren't enemies by chance. Each of them believe that they are fighting for the right future for Cybertron, even if their methods and values have very different approaches. That deeper conflict gives Transformers a depth that goes far beyond giant robot battles. I believe that's where Gundam's shadow becomes very important, as the anime proved that mecha could carry war drama by making robot battles feel like part of a larger political and military conflict. However, Transformers had to simplify this concept for its younger American audience. But still, the basic structure with rival factions, iconic leaders, military units, specialized warriors, and a slow brewing war that's been going on for longer than humanity could understand was still kept intact. I also want to add that Gundam normalized the mechanical world building, as mobile suits now had models, designations, roles, weapons, and a purpose on the battlefield. Although the Transformers universe did something similar in a more toy-friendly way, and that's why Autobots and Decepticons had their own functions, ranks, tech specs, and alternate modes they could use on the battlefield. This makes sense why Jazz was not the same type of character as Ironside, and Starscream was not the same type of threat as Soundwave. That alternate mode told you something about the character's job. Having said that, even if Gundam did not give Transformers their idea of transforming cars, it did shape the larger mecha environment where a robot war could be treated seriously enough to support a lore-heavy long-term conflict. I think, in a way, without Gundam, Transformers might still have been transforming toys without the idea of what a robot war with military structure looks like, which means the emotional weight just wouldn't have landed the same way. Diaclone. Okay, so this is a big one, as it's really the most important name on the list. So Diaclone is a toy line from the 1980s, launched by Takara with the help of major designers like Shoji Kawamori and Kazutaka Miyataka. This was never started as a cartoon or an anime, but a toy line with catalog fiction. However, if our discussions about what actually led to the existence of Transformers, you have to understand that Diaclone is not just an influence, but one of the literal foundations of the franchise. Takara's original concept mostly involved transforming machines operated by tiny humans. But these were not living alien robots. They were rather vehicles, robots, and machines that were being used in a science fiction battle. Then in 1982, Takara expanded the line with the concept of car robots, which basically featured robots that changed into contemporary cars and other vehicles. This is exactly where the road to Transformers becomes crystal clear, because as capitalism took its course, Hasbro saw Takara's transforming toys and immediately licensed them for the Western market. But there was something that they did differently. Instead of selling Diaclone and Microchange separately, Hasbro combined them under one new brand, which we now know as Transformers. But it was Marvel who eventually helped Hasbro create the backstories, personalities, factions, and names that turned these Transformer toys into such cool characters. In fact, you'll be surprised to know that many early Transformers toys actually came from Diaclone molds. Starting from the Autobot cars, several Decepticon jets, the Dinobots, the Constructicons, and other early designs, they all had roots in Diaclone. In fact, Optimus Prime's literal toy ancestor was Diaclone Battle Convoy, which basically means that the most famous Transformer of all time was actually Takara's originally transforming toy before he became Optimus Prime. But calling it a direct ripoff would be a wrong accusation, because Transformers didn't secretly steal Diaclone. Hasbro licensed and repackaged Takara toys, which is not the same as copying. However, from a creative point of view, yes, Transformers absolutely depend on Diaclone's work, and without Takara, early Transformers would look completely different. Having said that, the most vital change that Hasbro and Marvel made was turning these piloted machines into living alien beings. I think that one change simply transformed everything, because a Diaclone robot was a machine, but a Transformer was a living thing. But again, without Diaclone, there is no Optimus Prime as we know him, or no original Autobot car lineup in the same form. There's also no early G1 visual identity in the same way, so you can label Diaclone as the skeleton inside Transformers. Super Dimension Fortress Macross. This anime from the early 80s is one that usually pops up the most when you're talking about Transformers, especially because Super Dimension Fortress Macross made transforming mecha feel very modern, very military, and very, very believable. Now, the most famous machines in the original SDFM were the VF-1 Valkyries, which were variable fighters that could transform between a fighter jet mode, a humanoid robot mode, and a hybrid mode called Gerwak. I think this comes extremely close to the visual fantasy behind many Transformers, especially in the case of jet-based Decepticons, because we see a sleek aircraft become a humanoid battle machine, and that transformation truly looks like something designed by people who actually understand aircraft shapes and mechanical joints that could be translated into toys. I think Shoji Kawamori is a very important contributor in this case, as he worked in the design culture around both Diaclone and Macross, and is often associated with some of the transforming mecha thinking that shaped the early 1980s. This is particularly important here because Transformers came from the same mechanical design ideas and later altered that concept to become famous as a vehicle changing into a robot in a way that feels cool, clean, and, well, toyetic. Yeah, horrible pun, I agree. Anyway, Macross helped popularize a similar fantasy at almost the same historical moment that the Transformers were being born. The VF-1 Valkyrie made transforming fighter aircraft simply iconic, and I guess that's how Transformers came up with characters like Starscream, Thundercracker, Skywarp, and a whole tradition of jet-formed Decepticons. Again, this definitely does not mean these characters are simply a Macross ripoff, because the early Seeker toys actually came from Takara's Diaclone Jet Robo molds, and not directly from the VF-1. However, it still belongs to this list as it represents the wider early 90s explosion of changing robot design, which made the idea of military vehicles becoming humanoid machines feel like the resolute future. Moreover, it also brought emoticons into a mechanical war in order to turn it into a story that tackled alien conflict, music, romance, and military survival, coexisting with civilian life. But compared to that, Transformers was actually very simple. However, later, the franchise's stories also kept growing beyond toy battles to dig deeper into questions of culture, memory, survival, and war trauma. So yes, Macross didn't help create Transformers, but it surely defined the world of transforming mecha that made Transformers feel immediately exciting. Microman or Microchange. So Microman began in 1974 as a toy line catalog fiction and then went on to introduce a manga in 1976. If you think Diaclone was the reason Transformers came up with its vehicle army, you should know that Microchange gave Transformers some of its most bizarre and iconic ideas. Now, Microchange was connected to Takara's Microman line. Yeah, it seems he's become quite a recurring name in this video. Anyway, so Microman had the idea that the figures should be of the actual size, which basically meant that the toys represented small beings rather than scaled-down humans. Eventually, in 1983, Takara introduced Microchange, which leveled up that idea of transformation because now, instead of only vehicles, robots could also become everyday objects. And my friends, this is exactly where the concept of some of the most famous early Transformers came from. In fact, you'll be amazed to hear that Megatron came from a gun robot, Soundwave came from a cassette player robot, Reflector actually came from a camera, and Perceptor came from a microscope. Not just that, even the cassette characters, and I'm including the figures that became Laserbeak, Ravage, Frenzy, and Rumble, came from this same world of tiny transforming objects. That's how the phrase robots in disguise was conceived, because if you think about it, a robot hiding as a car is pretty cool. But a cassette player secretly being an alien intelligence is something that your brain simply refuses to forget. Having said that, I feel the same towards a gun that can become the Decepticon leader, or a camera that becomes 3 robots to add a spy-like quality, and even a microscope that becomes a scientist. In my opinion, Microchange also helped Transformers evolve out of the concept of cars and jets becoming robots. It made this universe feel like everything we see could be alive, which means your radio could be listening, your camera could be watching, or maybe your toy gun could be a tyrant from another planet. That's the literal bone marrow of what the Transformers franchise stands for, because Hasbro and Marvel unified the core idea of Diaclone and Microchange into one mythology. While they were simply separate toy concepts in Japan, with Transformers they could really become one alien species that belonged to the same war as they're all Cybertronians. Machine Robo or GoBots. So Machine Robo has a slightly different influence from Diaclone and Microchange because as it wasn't the direct source of Transformers toys. But it still belongs in the broader story of how the early 1980s became the perfect moment for Transformers to reign in the market. Well, Machine Robo began in Japan in 1982 as a toy line dealing with small transforming robots that could become vehicles, aircraft, and other machines. Now, in North America, many of these toys were released by Tonka as GoBots, and then this cartoon series called Challenge of the GoBots aired in 1984. Which was the same year that Transformers took over the market. For kids growing up in the mid-80s, this basically meant that they were suddenly seeing a battle between 2 very similar commercial ideas of transforming robots that have different personalities, factions, leaders, villains, and vehicle modes. While GoBots had Leader 1, Psykill, Turbo, Scooter, Copter, Crasher, and others, the Transformers had Optimus Prime, Megatron, Bumblebee, Starscream, Soundwave, and the rest. You have to understand that both of these franchises were built around robots that could disguise themselves as machines, and ironically, both of them turned transforming toys into the very identity of their story. However, the only difference here is that Transformers had a stronger mythology with more impactful names, a powerful faction branding, and of course, more dramatic character writing. I guess to the kids of the mid-80s, Autobots vs. Decepticons simply sounded grander than Guardians vs. Renegades. In fact, even Optimus Prime and Megatron felt like more legendary enemies. And just like that, the Transformers logo, tech specs, Marvel Comics, Sunbow Cartoon, and Takara Engineering all came together with incredible force to build what we know as the Transformers franchise. I guess the existence of Machine Robo and GoBots pretty much proved that the process of Transformers becoming a part of a wider transforming robot explosion. I mean, Japanese toy companies were already exploring the vehicle-to-robot concept, and American companies were racing to turn those toys into animated brands. So the market was more ready than ever to receive a perfect amalgamation of both with deeper world building. Well, that brings us to the very end of this video. It's really interesting how Transformers was never a direct ripoff, but a product of what could be seen as brilliant market research that allowed the franchise to build itself from a huge chain of influences that are now kind of forgotten. So what do you guys think about it all? Are any of these influences familiar to you? Let us know about your thoughts and opinions in the comment box below.